Weimar Culture, the Outsider as Insider. Abridged. By Peter Gay, read by Vincent Bagnall. The Weimar Republic had a short, hectic, and fascinating life. It was born on November the 9th, 1918, when the German Empire collapsed after 4 years of war, and Emperor Wilhelm II was preparing to flee into exile in the Netherlands. It was murdered on January the 30th, 1933, when President Paul von Hindenburg, no longer at the height of his powers, appointed the charismatic leader of the National Socialist Party, Adolf Hitler, Chancellor of the country. It was a time of almost continuous political upheaval, of brave efforts at stability, steadily undermined by economic ups and downs, mostly downs, sabotaged on the right by anti-democratic forces and on the left by communists following orders from Moscow. At the same time, the Weimar Republic was a breathless era of cultural flowering that drew the world's attention to German dance, German architecture, German filmmaking, German fiction, German theater, German art, and music. The Republic provided clusters of excitement way out of proportion to the mere 14 years of its life. The trauma of birth, from Weimar to Weimar. The Weimar Republic was an idea seeking to become reality. The decision to hold the Constituent Assembly at Weimar was taken primarily for prudential reasons. As Philipp Scheidemann, the first Prime Minister of the Republic, later admitted, Berlin was not safe, but Weimar also came to symbolize a prediction, or at least a hope, for a new start. It was tacit acknowledgement of the charge, widely made in Allied countries during the war and indignantly denied in Germany, that there were really two Germanys, the Germany of military swagger, abject submission to authority, aggressive foreign adventure, and obsessive preoccupation with form, and the Germany of lyrical poetry, humanist philosophy, and Pacific cosmopolitanism. Germany had tried the way of Bismarck and Schlieffen. Now it was ready to try the way of Goethe and Humboldt. It is easy, too easy, to ridicule this solemn search for a usable past. 15 years later, in English exile, the distinguished historian Arthur Rosenberg recalled the Constitutional Assembly with some acerbity. History, he wrote, enjoys discrediting arbitrarily chosen symbols. There is some justice in this observation. The choice of Weimar was in part a symptom of wishful thinking. To found a country in the city of Goethe did not guarantee a country in Goethe's image. It did not even guarantee its survival. The Republic was born in defeat, lived in turmoil, and died in disaster. And from the beginning there were many who saw its travail with superb indifference or with that unholy delight in the suffering of others, for which the Germans have coined that evocative term, Schadenfreude. Still, the choice of Weimar was neither quixotic nor arbitrary. For a time, the Republic had a real chance. Whatever some derisive historians have said, if the end of the Republic was implied in its beginning, that end was not inevitable. As Tony Stolper, a survivor and perceptive observer of Weimar, has noted, the Republic was marked by creativity in the midst of suffering, hard work in the midst of repeated disappointments, hope in the face of pitiless and powerful adversaries. I might add that it is precisely this easy pessimism which then saw and still sees the Republic as doomed from the start, that helped to fulfill the prophecies it made. The end of Weimar was not inevitable, because there were Republicans who took the symbol of Weimar seriously and who tried persistently and courageously to give the ideal real content. The Weimar ideal was both old and new, the striking mixture of cynicism and confidence, the search for novelty and for roots, the solemn irreverence of the 20s were a child of war, revolution, and democracy. But the elements that made it up came from both the distant and recent past, recalled and revived by a new generation, Goethe and Schopenhauer. Historic dates like 1848 and 1871 were living realities for the new Weimar, while the immediate ancestry of the Weimar style, still passionately debated, went back to the turn of the century and the 1890s. In German art, the transition from bourgeois to popular, that is, from impressionist to expressionist, art had long preceded the revolution. This view, expressed in a conversation of cultivated amateurs held in early 1919, in the midst of revolution, was accurate enough. After all, Frank Wiedekind completed his first and still most important play, Frühlingserwachen, in 1891, or Spring Awakening, a year after Wilhelm II had dismissed Bismarck, and long before the emperor had fully tested his peculiar talent for disaster. Imperial Germany was studiedly hostile to the modern movement. The emperor and his Empress August Victoria set the tone, and their taste ran to gaudy parades, glittering medals, sentimental, heroic portraits. The Siegesallee in Berlin, an ambitious double row of marble statues commemorating the unmemorable war expression and symptom of Wilhelminian taste. The universities in which Germans took such ostentatious pride were nurseries of a woolly-minded militarist idealism and centers of resistance to the new in art, or the social sciences. Jews, Democrats, socialists, in a word, outsiders, were kept from the sacred precinct of higher learning. The Empress interfered with the staging of Strauss's Salome and kept Strauss's Rosenkavalier from opening in Berlin, taking charming and talented decadence for impermissible immorality. The government harassed Kathi Kollwitz for her proletarian posters, while in 1908 the emperor dismissed Hugo von Tschudi, director of the National Gallery in Berlin, for his subversive tastes in art. 4 years later, when Kandinsky and Mayer published their collective volume of essays, pictures, and musical examples, Der Blaue Reiter, they fittingly dedicated it to Tschudi's memory. But a Wilhelminian Germany, though Philistine and oppressive, was not a dictatorship, and the modern movement fed on opposition. Expressionism, which would dominate Weimar culture during its formative years, was fully matured in the empire. Expressionist painters and poets made inflammatory statements, exhibited outrageous pictures, published avant-garde little magazines, and gathered for collaboration and comfort in informal groups like Die Brücke and Der Blaue Reiter. Their ranks were decimated before the revolution. For the outsiders of the empire, as later for the insiders of the Republic, the most insistent questions revolved around the need for man's renewal. Questions made most urgent and practically insoluble by the disappearance of God, the threat of the machine, the incurable stupidity of the upper classes, and the helpless Philistinism of the bourgeoisie. Seeking answers to their questions, the rebels turned to whatever help they could find, wherever they could find it. There was nothing unusual in this. Man's articulate misery or articulate delight has never been a respecter of frontiers. But it was precisely this, the commonplace quality of cosmopolitanism in the empire, that later gave the Weimar style its toughness of fiber, in its unself-conscious internationalism. It shared the vitality of other cultural movements in European history. What the war did was to destroy the ties of German culture, both to the usable past and to the congenial foreign environment, for all but the most determined cosmopolitans. A very few kept communications open. In 1915, in the midst of war, the Fabian socialist and distinguished psychologist Graham Wallas wrote to his friend, the German revisionist socialist Edward Bernstein, "Nowadays one lives from day to day and scarcely dares to think about the future. But sometimes I hope that when peace comes, you and I may meet and shake hands and tell each other that we have never had one thought of each that was not kind, and then sit down to consider whether we can help in any way to heal the wounds of civilization." It was the cultural task of the Weimar Republic to capitalize on such noble sentiments, to restore the broken ties. It is the tragedy of the Weimar Republic that while it succeeded in this task, the brilliance of the refugees from Hitler is a measure of that success. The trauma of its birth was so severe that it could never enlist the wholehearted loyalty of all, or even many of its beneficiaries. The revolution had widespread support at the outset. It was as a result of the First World War, Walter Gropius had written, that the full consciousness of his social responsibility as an architect first came to him. Late in 1918, on furlough in Germany from the Italian front, Gropius decided to travel to Berlin. As he witnessed the indignities visited on officers by the crowds, he was seized by a sudden thought. This is more than just a lost war. A world has come to an end. We must seek a radical solution to our problems. Gropius was not alone. The progression of his intellectual career, ideas developed in the empire, given political direction by the war, and finding open expression in the revolution was characteristic of many representatives of the Weimar spirit. The revolution aroused the enthusiasm of Bertolt Brecht, who, like many other young men, had been revolted by years of slaughter. Wilke greeted the revolution with impetuous joy, as he put it in his poetic way, with the ardent hope that mankind would for once turn over a new page. Others discovered similar hopes from different perspectives. Conservative ideologists were delighted to see the collapse of a regime that had not been idealistic enough to embody true conservatism. Bourgeois intellectuals like Friedrich Meinecke, though they were filled with rage against the Allied powers, offered their support. Soldiers and their families, Democrats, socialists, pacifists, and utopians looked to the revolution as the promise of a new life. there were many old ghosts at the Weimar Assembly, and while some were laid to rest, new ones emerged. The first 4 years of the Republic were years of almost uninterrupted crisis, a true time of troubles, the bloody Civil War, the reemergence of the military as a factor in politics, the failure to discredit the aristocratic industrial alliance that had dominated the empire, the frequency of political assassination and the impunity of political assassins, the imposition of the Versailles Treaty, the Cap Putsch, and other attempts at internal subversions, the French occupation at the Ruhr, the astronomical inflation. All this gave new hope to monarchists, to fanatical militarists, to anti-Semites and xenophobes of all sorts, to industrialists at first frightened by the specter of socialization and then contemptuous of socialists who would not socialize, and served to make the Republic appear a fraud or a farce. The very birth of the Republic had its farcical elements. It was proclaimed in the early afternoon of November the 9th, 1918, by the socialist Philip Scheidemann, not from pure Republican enthusiasm, but from an anxious desire to forestall the proclamation of a Soviet Republic by Karl Liebknecht. When Friedrich Ebert learned of Scheidemann's action a few minutes later, he was furious with the irregularity of the proceedings. No one could fail to notice that the Republic came into the world almost by accident and covered with apologies. Beyond all this, there was another subtler inducement to cynicism and detachment. In August 1914, the Western world had experienced a war psychosis. The war seemed a release from boredom, an invitation to heroism, a remedy for decadence. But it was in Germany that this psychosis reached heights of absurdity. The overaged, the adolescent, the unfit volunteered with pure joy and went to death, filled with their mission. The war offered purification, liberation, and enormous hope. It set the hearts of poets aflame with a sense of relief that a peaceful world had collapsed, a world of which one was so tired, so dreadfully tired. Only victory at any price could give the meaning of life. The Germans had at last united as a folk. Germans alone were truthful, authentic, manly, objective, a land of heroes facing opponents saddled with cowardice, mendacity, and baseness. Good old words like Volk and Reich and Geist were now given new meaning by this great crusade for Kultur. The settlement imposed on Germany at Versailles was in many ways a harsh and vindictive treaty. Some among the leading Allied negotiators wanted not settlement, but revenge. It was not defeat alone that produced traumas. Victory, too, after years of frustration, bloodshed, and endless misery, seemed to many somehow unbearable. The making of the treaty was a constant and deliberate humiliation of the Germans. Once the Allies had worked out their differences in a series of compromises, they invited the Germans in mid-April 1919 to send a delegation to Versailles to receive peace conditions. Their task was to sign, not to negotiate. The treatment of the German delegation, widely publicized in the German press, was one long, calculated insult. The train that took them to Paris moved with deliberate slowness through the battlefields of northern France until the sight became unbearable. Once in Versailles, the Germans found themselves fenced off, ostensibly to be protected from hostile demonstrations, actually to be isolated from Allied negotiators. What could the Germans do? They refused to sign, and they signed on May 12th. Prime Minister Scheidemann had called the treaty unacceptable and asked rhetorically, "What hand must not wither, which puts these fetters on itself and on us?" Scheidemann's hand remained intact. On June 20th, after the Catholic Centre Party and a majority of his own Social Democratic Party voted to accept the treaty, with the exception of Article 231 and the article demanding the handing over of war criminals, he resigned. The burden of signing this shameful, humiliating peace fell on the shoulders of other social democrats and on Erzberger, the most prominent advocate of peace in the Centre Party. They were brave men, accepting as their lot a political liability they would never wholly shake off. The community of reason, conciliators and critics. There were thousands in Weimar, professors, industrialists, politicians, who hated the Nazis, but did not love the Republic. Well-educated, intelligent, reluctant to exchange the values of the empire for the dubious dispensations of democracy. Many of these men were paralyzed by their conflicts and pursued, through the years of Weimar, public careers of honorable impotence, punctuated by fitful activity. They learned to live with the Republic, judged its advent a historical necessity, and respected some of its leaders, but they never learned to love it, and never believed in its future. They came to be called rational Republicans. Republicans from intellectual choice, rather than passionate conviction. The rejection of politics was a new version of an old habit of mind. For over a century, Germans had looked upon politics with a mixture of fascination and aversion. The enormous numbers of newspapers and the space they gave to politics, once the censor could let them, and the high rate of participation in elections strongly suggest that Germans took to politics with a passion. As soon as they could be political, they were political. Much of this restless expenditure of energy might be self-important busy work. Germans themselves like to satirize their incurable inclination to form clubs, or the public acting out of private passions. But it was at least what is normally called the political activity, political talk, canvassing, voting. Foolish politics is still politics. But side by side with this stream of thought, there ran another channel, crowded with traffic and dug deep by careful dredging, the aversion to politics. Not to this or that policy, this or that party, but to politics as such. The pursuit of politics is a habit, like all habits strengthened by practice and atrophied by disuse. Germans had little practice in politics. The authoritarian states of the 18th and 19th centuries, large or small, had lived largely under the fiat of their rulers. There were few newspapers. In the newspapers there had little political news and no political independence. Only a handful of states could boast public debating societies known as parliaments. The imperial institutions that Bismarck built in 1871 by appearing to be better made things worse. They were, as the veteran Social Democrat Wilhelm Liebknecht colorfully put it, fig leaves for absolutism. The federal structure of the new German Empire barely concealed the predominance of Prussia. The universal manhood suffrage for the federal parliament was badly compromised by Prussia's reactionary three-class electoral system, which kept all the power in the hands of the powerful. The Reichstag was only a shadow parliament, since the chancellor was responsible not to it, but to his emperor. The changes of cabinets, coupled with the rise of extremist parties like the Nazis, suggested that the coalitions were papering over deep cracks. They were coalitions without consensus. There were too many for whom the general will seemed obscure or lacking altogether. The phenomenon of the party press did little to migrate the divisions in German society. Millions of voters read only the newspapers of their party, thus hardening attitudes they already held. The Centre Party, for one, could count on about 300 newspapers throughout the country, nearly all of them of modest circulation, all of them provincial and parochial. None of them was official. The center had no equivalent for the Nazis' Völkischer Beobachter or the Social Democrats' Vorwärts. And they were stubbornly independent in management, but they remained dependably partisan in their treatment of political news. The hunger for wholeness found its most poignant expression in the youth. After the war, German youth, restless, bewildered, often incurably estranged from the Republic, sought salvation in the poets, but it also found other more prosaic, if not less strenuous, guides. The youth movement, which had had its modest beginnings at the turn of the century and flourished mightily through the 20s, collected among its ranks and preserved among its graduates many would-be thinkers hunting for an organic philosophy of life. The complex of feelings and responses I have called the hunger for wholeness turns out on examination to be a great regression born from a great fear, the fear of modernity. The abstractions that Tönnies and Hofmannsthal and the others manipulated, Volk, Führer, Organismus, Reich, Entscheidung, Gemeinschaft, reveal a desperate need for roots and for community, a vehement, often vicious repudiation of reason, accompanied by the urge for direct action or for surrender to a charismatic leader. The hunger for wholeness was awash with hate. The political and sometimes the private world of its chief spokesman was a paranoid world filled with enemies. The dehumanizing machine, capitalist materialism, godless rationalism, rootless society, cosmopolitan Jews, and that great all-devouring monster, the city. The course of studies at the Bauhaus was designed to turn rhetoric into reality. After passing the elementary course, each student was trained in the workshop by two masters, who imparted, it was hoped, a mastery of materials as well as aesthetics, of content and form together. A dual education of this kind, Gropius later wrote, would enable the coming generation to achieve the reunion of all forms of creative work and become the architects of a new civilization. In 1922, Klee drew a symbolic representation of this program. A 7-pointed star is inscribed in a circular band. This band represents the preliminary training that encloses the several materials: glass, stone, wood, and the several courses, construction, color, composition, and leads to the heart of the star, another circle in which the double aim of the Bauhaus is proudly displayed: Bau und Bühne, building and stage. The atmosphere of the new Bauhaus was experimental, cheerful, splendidly vigorous. One need only think of some of the teachers to recreate it: Paul Klee, Wassily Kandinsky, Lionel Feininger, Gerhard Marx, Oskar Schlemmer, Josef Albers. The activity of the Bauhaus was inventive and versatile: typography, furniture design, lamps, rugs, pottery, bookbinding, the dance. All were treated with enormous freedom, and many of them, as we know, had lasting influence. We still sit in chairs designed by Marcel Breuer and read typefaces first drawn by Herbert Bayer. The atmosphere of the Bauhaus was curious, exhilarating. The Bauhaus was a family, a school, a cooperative business, a missionary society. Neither Gropius nor the other masters believed in disciples. It was not an academy where the great teacher reproduces little editions of himself, but a laboratory where students simulated teachers, and teachers students. Utility and beauty did not merely stand side by side. The masters strove to make them as one. Though there was room for pure beauty as well, some of Feininger's, Klee's, and Kandinsky's most interesting graphic work was done at the Bauhaus. And high morale was essential, not merely to creativity, but to sheer survival. Berlin, early in the Republic and late, was a city of excitement and hope, the future of Germany, Heinrich Mann said in 1921. is being tentatively anticipated by Berlin. The man who wants to gather hope should look there. Berlin is a breeder of civilization, and it, rather than laws, will finally affect the unification of Germany. Yes, Berlin will be the beloved capital, little though it imagined that it would be. It sucked up into itself talents real and spurious with tornado-like powers. In those days, one spoke of Berlin as one speaks of a highly desirable woman, whose coldness and coquettishness are widely known. She was called arrogant, snobbish, parvenue, uncultivated, common, but she was the center of everyone's fantasies and the goal of everyone's desires. Everyone wanted her. She enticed everyone. The man who had Berlin owned the world. It was a city that demanded and gave energies. We needed little sleep and we were never tired. It was a city of crooks and cripples, a city of hit songs and endless talk, with a press that was cruel, pitiless, aggressive, filled with bloody irony, yet not discouraging, and with criticism that was in the same way harsh, nonconformist, but fair, in search of quality, delighted with excellence. Berlin tasted of the future, and that is why we gladly took the crap and the coldness. If Berlin tasted of the future, the taste of Berlin was cruelly mistaken. There was little future left. Life would not leave art alone. Things seemed markedly better on all fronts during those golden mid-20s. Unemployment was down, wages were up, political extremism seemed played out. The Weimar Republic was getting to be a good place to live in, and gradually, precisely in these years, Germany ended her isolation and rejoined the community of nations. Gustav Stresemann's foreign policy and the sheer passage of time were paying off. But Weimar of those years was like the society on the magic mountain, ruddy cheeks concealed insidious symptoms. One of the most insidious of these was the cartelization of culture, on the model of the cartelization of industry. The Weimar Republic in 1932 was clear vision and political impotence, fear, suspicion, and moments of irrational hope among the politicians of the middle. Politics as usual, but with everyone else, a sense of emergency. The situation had aspects of high tragedy. They were alienated from the institutions they knew they must defend against the new barbarians, and if they were bellicose at all, they were ready to fight the Nazis in the forlorn hope, not of keeping things as they were, but of making, in the spirit of Weimar, something better than the Weimar Republic. Months later, Adolf Hitler was Chancellor of Germany, and the men of Weimar scattered, taking the spirit of Weimar with them into the Aesopianism of internal migration, into death in the extermination camps, into suicide in a Berlin apartment after a knock on the door, on the Spanish frontier, in a rented flat in Paris, in a Swedish village, in a Brazilian town, or in a New York hotel room. But others took the spirit of Weimar into life, into great careers and lasting influence in laboratories, in hospitals, in journalism, in theaters, in universities, and gave that spirit its true home in exile.
Schön. Ach, Dankeschön. Dankeschön.